There is a law. I want you to hear it. Not a paraphrase. The actual statute, passed by the Illinois General Assembly in 1851 and still fully enforceable the morning of June 18, 1860. It reads, "Married women and infants who, in the judgment of the medical superintendent, are evidently insane or distracted, may be received into the hospital on the request of the husband of the woman or the guardian of the infant, without the evidence of insanity required in other cases." Without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. Read it again. Slowly. A husband's request, a doctor's signature. That was the complete mechanism. No hearing, no witness, no opportunity to speak in your own defense. The woman did not need to be present for the decision. She did not need to be informed before it was made. Under Illinois law, a married woman occupied the same legal category as an infant, someone for whom another person made the determinations. Someone who, by definition, could not be trusted to know her own mind. The law did not ask what the woman had done. It did not require that she had harmed herself or anyone else. It required only that a husband believed she was insane, and in 1860, the definition of insanity for women was wide enough to swallow almost anything. Religious disagreement, excessive reading, a fondness for political opinion, a refusal to submit. The asylum sat at the end of a very short road, and a great many men knew exactly where it was. Elizabeth Packard was not the first. She was not the last. She was, as it turned out, the one who wrote it down and refused to stop. Consider what was happening across American state lines during this period. In New York, the Utica State Lunatic Asylum was receiving women committed for what intake records called mental excitement, a category broad enough to include any woman who raised her voice, attended suffrage meetings, or in at least 2 documented cases, wrote letters to newspapers under her own name. In Massachusetts, a woman named Abigail Burr had been committed in 1847 by her brother. Not her husband, her brother. After she announced her intention to bequeath her property to a school for free black children, which her family described in the commitment petition as an act of unsound mind. In Indiana, asylum records from the 1850s include a woman whose stated cause of insanity was reading abolitionist literature. These are not apocryphal. The records exist. They are in the archives of those states, filed under the ordinary bureaucratic categories of 19th century institutional record-keeping, which is itself a kind of testimony that the people doing the filing did not think they were documenting anything unusual. The Illinois statute was not unique. Similar provisions existed in New York, Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, and Massachusetts, among others. Some states required a physician's signature in addition to the husband's request. Some required 2 physicians. A few required a brief examination. None required the woman's testimony. None required that she be present at the proceeding that determined her fate. The legal logic across all these states was the same. A married woman was, legally, an extension of her husband's household. Her mental fitness was a domestic matter, and domestic matters were his to manage. This is not a story about monsters, though there are people in it who do monstrous things. This is a story about a system, a legal apparatus, a medical institution, a social contract that was designed, maintained, and defended by ordinary people who believed, genuinely believed, that they were helping. The asylum was not a dungeon. It was, its founders insisted, a refuge, a place of healing, a scientific intervention in human suffering. That the suffering it most efficiently addressed was the suffering of the men left behind. That the women it received were not healed, but contained. This was not a bug. It was the architecture. Elizabeth Parsons Ware was 34 years old when she married Theophilus Packard, Jr., in 1839. She was tall. People who knew her in those years mentioned her height, the way it read as a kind of presumption in a parlor, with dark eyes and what one acquaintance described as a certain stillness in the face that made you want to fill the silence before she did. She had been educated at the Amherst Female Seminary. She read widely. She had opinions about theology, about the nature of grace, about whether a God of infinite love could consign the unbaptized to hell. She kept those opinions mostly to herself in the early years of the marriage. Theophilus was a Calvinist minister. He was not a man who experienced his wife's opinions as an invitation to dialogue. He was shorter than she was, slight. With a neat dark beard he kept trimmed to a point. And the habit, people noticed this, of pausing before he spoke. Not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted you to know the pause was deliberate. He had been educated at Andover Theological Seminary. He had the minister's voice, controlled, resonant, used to filling rooms with certainty. He believed in predestination. He believed in the sovereignty of God and the depravity of man. He believed that his wife's job was to be a helpmeet, and that a helpmeet did not contradict her husband's theology in front of the Bible class he taught in their parlor every Sunday. Elizabeth contradicted him anyway. Not loudly. She did not storm or shout. She raised her hand, as one does in a class, and she offered an alternative interpretation. She had been thinking about it for some time. The question of whether free will and Calvinist predestination could coexist, whether the concept of universal atonement might be reconciled with Scripture. She had read extensively. She cited passages. This was not a performance. She believed it. Theophilus watched her across the parlor, surrounded by neighbors and parishioners, his wife's voice steady and clear and utterly, absolutely certain of itself. He told her afterward that she was not to speak again in Bible class. She told him she had a right to her opinions. He wrote later, and this is in his own letters, his own words, that he understood then that his wife's mind was under the influence of an insane excitement on religious subjects. Not a disagreement. Not an error in theology. An insanity. The language is important. Understand what Theophilus Packard was doing, not consciously, perhaps not even dishonestly, but doing it nonetheless. He was translating disagreement into pathology. His wife did not have a different opinion. She had a disease, and disease required treatment. He had 6 children with Elizabeth. The youngest was an infant in the summer of 1860. The house was full. 3 boys, 3 girls, the smell of bread and river mud from the Manteno streets, the sound of small feet above on the floorboards. Elizabeth taught Sunday school. She took in sewing. She ran the household. She was not, by any observable measure, incapacitated. She was, by the measure that mattered to Theophilus, out of control. In the spring of 1860, he consulted with 2 physicians, Dr. J. W. Brown and a second doctor, whose name does not appear in the records. He did not tell Elizabeth he was consulting them. He did not tell her what he was planning. He told the doctors that his wife had become mentally unsound, religiously deluded, he said, unable to manage herself or her convictions. Both doctors agreed to sign the necessary papers. Neither of them examined Elizabeth at any length. One of them, Brown, apparently visited the house briefly and spoke with her for less than an hour. He came dressed in ordinary clothes. He did not identify himself as a physician. He was, in other words, gathering evidence for a conclusion that had already been reached. June 18th, 1860. A Tuesday. Elizabeth Packard was in her bedroom. This is in her own account, written later from memory, when she heard the sound of a wagon on the street. Not an unusual sound. She was getting dressed. There was a knock at the front door. then voices below, and then footsteps on the stairs. And then the bedroom door opened and Theophilus entered, followed by two other men, one of whom was Dr. Brown, and one of whom she did not recognize. They came into my room, she wrote, and told me I was to go with them. She asked where. Theophilus told her she was going to Jacksonville, to the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane. She asked on what grounds. He told her the grounds were that she was insane. She stood very still. This is what she wrote, that she stood still for a moment and understood, and then began to put on her shoes, because there was nothing else to do. There was no appeal, no hearing scheduled, no lawyer she could call, no family she could summon in time. The men were already in her bedroom. The wagon was already outside. The law had already decided. The bedroom smelled of morning, the particular smell of a room that has been slept in, warm and close, cut through now with the outdoor cold that had come in with the men. The curtains were still drawn on one side. Theophilus stood by the door, with his hands at his sides. The two doctors stood slightly behind him. Brown would not meet her eyes. The unnamed second physician had his hat in his hands and was turning it slowly by the brim. She put on her shoes. She put on her coat. She asked to speak to her children. Theophilus said there wasn't time. She asked again. He said the children were busy. She picked up a small bag she kept at the foot of the bed, a traveling bag she had never used for anything significant. And she put into it a change of clothes, a Bible, and a book she had been reading, a theological text whose title she does not record in her account. Brown stepped forward and took the bag from her and looked inside it and handed it back. She does not say what she was feeling during this. She describes the actions only. The shoes, the coat, the bag, the examination of the bag, the return of the bag. Her children were in the house. The infant was downstairs. She did not get to say goodbye properly. The men were impatient. Theophilus was standing by the door, and she was a woman who understood, in that moment, that impatience was now the only thing she would be permitted to experience. The Jacksonville Insane Asylum was 170 miles south of Montano. It had opened in 1851 and was considered, by the standards of the era, a progressive institution. The grounds were carefully landscaped. The building was red brick, Italianate in style, with a central tower that could be seen from the train approach. Its superintendent, Dr. Andrew McFarland, had studied under the leading alienists of the day. The men who defined American psychiatry before the field had that name. He had written papers on the moral treatment of insanity. He believed in fresh air, occupation, gentle care. He was known among his peers as a humane administrator. He was 44 years old in 1860, with a broad forehead and the slightly distracted look of a man who was almost always thinking about something else. He had managed the asylum for several years and had developed an institutional pride in its reputation. When new patients arrived, he conducted an intake examination himself. He took notes. Elizabeth Packard arrived at Jacksonville in June 1860 and was received into the women's ward. McFarland examined her. He spoke with her at length. She was articulate, he wrote, and presented her case with considerable coherence. He noted her theological views. He noted that she disagreed with her husband on matters of Calvinist doctrine, specifically on the question of free moral agency. He noted that she expressed anger at being confined. And then, in his intake notes, he wrote something that would matter enormously 3 years later. He wrote, "Patient appears rational." 3 words. A doctor's observation, written in the institutional record, tucked into a ledger that would sit in a filing cabinet while Elizabeth Packard lived on Ward 8, Building 2, among women whose conditions ranged from genuine psychotic illness to postpartum distress to, in several documented cases, the same crime as Elizabeth's, the crime of being inconvenient. She spent 3 years there. Not weeks, not months. 3 years. To understand what 3 years inside Jacksonville meant, you have to understand what the institution actually was. Not the idea of it, not the stated purpose, but the physical and social reality of the place where Elizabeth Packard woke up every morning for 1,095 consecutive mornings. The Jacksonville State Hospital for the Insane occupied a large campus of grounds on the south edge of the city. From a distance, and from the perspective of the architects and civic leaders who had lobbied for its construction, it was an emblem of progressive government. The state of Illinois demonstrating its commitment to the humane care of the mentally ill. The grounds were tended. There were gardens. There was a farm attached to the property, where patients who were ambulatory and considered stable performed agricultural labor. This was not called labor. It was called therapeutic occupation, which is a distinction the institution considered important and the patients considered less so. Since the crops produced on the farm supplied the institution's kitchen, and the institution's kitchen fed the institution's staff along with its patients, and the financial savings were real, and the therapy was theoretical. The main building was heated, which was not true of all institutions of the era. There was a chapel. There were organized activities, sewing circles, musical performances, supervised walks on the grounds when the weather permitted, and the patient's file did not indicate that walks were contraindicated, which was a determination made by the staff. In the women's wing, the wards were organized by severity of case, or at least by what the institution categorized as severity, which was not always the same thing. Ward 8, where Elizabeth was placed, was for women considered stable enough not to require the more restrictive wards, but not considered recovered enough for the transitional wards that preceded release. It was, in institutional terms, the indefinite middle, the place where women stayed when the system had decided what to do with them. And that decision was nothing. The ward held approximately 40 women. Their conditions ranged widely. Some had genuine psychotic illnesses, what we would now recognize as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder with psychotic features, conditions that were real and serious and which the institution was genuinely trying to treat with the tools available in 1860, which were not many and not good. Some had postpartum depression severe enough to have frightened their families into action. Some had what we would now recognize as trauma responses. Women who had survived violence, loss, poverty in its most grinding forms, and whose minds had done what minds do when the weight becomes too much. And some were Elizabeth. Some were there because a husband or father or brother had signed a piece of paper. The ward smelled of lye and cooked cabbage and something underneath both of those, something organic and close. The smell of bodies in a confined space where the windows were opened only at scheduled times. The floors were wood, scrubbed weekly, but not often enough. The women slept in rooms that held between 6 and 12 beds. The beds had straw mattresses. In winter, the rooms were cold until mid-morning, and the cold had a particular quality. Damp, settling into the fabric of your clothes and staying there all day. Some of the women cried at night. Some of them did not cry at all, which was in some ways harder to hear than the crying. Elizabeth was permitted to write letters. Theophilus had not prohibited correspondence, perhaps because it had not occurred to him that it mattered, or perhaps because he trusted the institution to intercept anything he would not want received. Letters sent to Elizabeth from outside were, in documented cases, read by staff before delivery. Letters she sent out were held or discarded at the staff's discretion. She was not always informed of this. She wrote anyway. She wrote constantly. She began keeping a journal. Smuggled in sections in letters, in notes hidden in the lining of a bag returned to her by a visiting neighbor. She was writing the account of what was happening to her in real time, which meant she understood. Even while it was happening, the testimony would be necessary. She was already planning. The journal covered everything. The physical conditions of the ward, the temperature at different times of day, the quality of the food, the schedule of the supervised walks, and the criteria by which a patient was deemed eligible or ineligible for them, the behavior of individual staff members, their names when she could learn them, the specific incidents she witnessed. A nurse named Collins, who pulled a woman's hair when she did not move quickly enough during the morning routine. The practice of placing patients in cold baths, called hydrotherapy in the institutional vocabulary, and it was a real medical practice believed by its proponents to be therapeutic, and Elizabeth documented it without editorializing, because she had already decided that the facts were sufficient, and that any editorializing would be used to describe her as emotional, which was a category the institution was prepared for, and which she refused to give them. She wrote down other women's stories when they would tell them. A woman named Frances, Elizabeth gives only the first name, who had been committed after her husband's business failed, and she had become, in the language of the intake record, melancholic and despairing. Frances believed she would be released when the business matters were settled. She had been in the ward for 2 years. Elizabeth does not record what she said to Frances about this belief. She records that Frances had a way of turning toward the window when she spoke, as though addressing someone outside, and that her hands, which had been a seamstress's hands before the asylum, moved constantly in her lap, practicing stitches that had no thread. A woman named Clara, who had been a schoolteacher in Peoria and who had written articles, published under a man's name in a local newspaper, arguing against the denial of female suffrage. Her husband had not been aware of the articles until a colleague of his identified the writing style and told him. Clara had been at Jacksonville for 14 months when Elizabeth arrived, and had been told that her release depended on her agreement to discontinue the writing. She had not agreed. She had been at Jacksonville for 3 years when Elizabeth was released. Elizabeth tried to include Clara's case in her first book. Clara's husband threatened legal action. The passage was removed. This is in Elizabeth's correspondence. The letter to her publisher explaining the removal, dated 1864. She describes it as a small surrender on my part, of which I am not proud. Then she describes her plan to address Clara's case in the legislative testimony instead, where it would be in the public record and beyond the reach of private legal threat. She was not sentimental about tactics. A woman named Sarah Minard, a patient in her ward, committed for what the intake record listed as religious mania and what Sarah herself described, in conversation, as a period of intense Methodist revival participation her husband had found embarrassing, told Elizabeth in her second month that there was a woman on Ward 6 who had been there for 9 years. 9 years! She had arrived as a young woman, Sarah said, and had no family that visited now, and the staff called her by her first name the way you call a piece of furniture. Elizabeth wrote this down. She also wrote down the names of the staff who treated patients roughly, the names of the women whose letters she witnessed being opened. The days when patients were placed in restraints not because they were dangerous, but because they were loud, which was, in the language of the ward, the same thing. She wrote it all down because she already understood what this place was, and she already understood. This is the part that requires a moment to hold. That her own clarity was being used against her. Because any woman who understood the asylum clearly enough to document it was, by institutional logic, demonstrating the very pathology that required her to be there. If she was calm, it was the calm of a managed patient. If she was angry, it was evidence of instability. If she wrote, she was obsessive. If she stopped writing, she was deteriorating. The diagnostic frame was total. There was no behavior she could exhibit that the institution could not interpret as confirmation of its own judgment. This is not paranoia. This is what the records show. Dr. McFarland visited the ward regularly. He spoke with Elizabeth. In her account, and there is no strong reason to doubt it, since it is consistent with his own contemporaneous notes, he was not unkind to her. He engaged with her arguments. He listened. There were conversations about theology, about the legal basis of her commitment, about the nature of sanity itself. She later described him as a man of intelligence who was choosing not to use it honestly, which is a precise and patient kind of fury. He continued for a time to note in his records that her condition was stable and her behavior orderly. He did not, in those early months, move to discharge her. His power to do so was not unlimited. The law gave the husband the primary authority over a married woman's commitment, and a discharge over Theophilus's objection would have been unusual. But he had influence. He could have advocated. He did not. The children aged without her. The infant she had left behind in June 1860 was learning to walk. The older children, she had heard this through letters that reached her intermittently, had been told by Theophilus that their mother was ill. Not that she had been committed. Ill. The word hung in the house, she imagined, like a smell that no one could locate the source of. Her oldest son, Theophilus Jr., was 17. She thought about him often. He knew, she suspected, more than he was permitted to say. She was permitted one visitor in her first year. A neighbor woman, a Mrs. Hazlitt, who came twice and brought Elizabeth a clean blouse and a jar of preserves, and sat with her for 90 minutes each time, not saying much, just sitting there in the visiting room with its single window and its institutional smell of floor wax and something floral that didn't quite cover the floor wax. Elizabeth held the jar of preserves in both hands during the second visit. She didn't open it, just held it. There was another woman in the visiting room that day. Elizabeth did not know her name then. She found it out later from another patient. Her name was Margaret, and she was in her 50s, and she sat across from a young man who appeared to be her son, and they spoke in very low voices, and at the end of the visit, the young man stood and thanked the attending nurse and put on his hat and walked out, and Margaret stayed in her chair and watched the door close. She stayed in that chair until the nurse came and told her it was time to return to the ward. She did not speak to Elizabeth. She stood and walked back in the direction the nurse indicated and did not look back. Elizabeth wrote her down. The second year was different. Theophilus came in the autumn of 1861. He was accompanied by his brother, who served as a kind of witness, or perhaps a chaperone for himself, the way some men bring company to difficult conversations, because the company makes the conversation feel less like what it is. Theophilus had been corresponding with McFarland. This is documented. The letters are in the Illinois State Archives. He had not written to discuss Elizabeth's condition. He had written to discuss her beliefs. Specifically, to provide additional theological context for why her beliefs constituted, in his view, evidence of derangement. McFarland's tone in his correspondence with Theophilus is careful, professional. Not warm, exactly, but deferential in the way one professional is deferential to a man who has brought him his business. He noted Theophilus's concerns. He said he was monitoring the situation. He said, and this is in a letter dated October 14th, 1861, that he was not without hope that the patient's unfortunate views may in time be corrected. Unfortunate views. 3 words again. Read them against the 3 words from the intake notes. Patient appears rational. And watch the distance between them. Watch what happened in the space between those 2 notes, in the correspondence with the husband, in the careful professional calculation of what a superintendent owed to the man who had delivered the patient and who could, at any time, make things complicated for the institution if the institution did not cooperate. McFarland made a choice, not loudly, not in a single dramatic moment. He made it in the incremental way that institutional betrayal is almost always made. One careful letter, one adjusted note, one shifted assessment at a time until the original observation, patient appears rational, was so thoroughly buried beneath subsequent documentation that it required a court case to excavate it. It is worth sitting with this for a moment. Andrew McFarland was not a stupid man. He was not, by the standards of his profession, a bad doctor. He had written papers on the moral treatment of insanity that were, for 1860, humane in their orientation. Papers that argued against the use of mechanical restraints, that emphasized the importance of treating patients with dignity, that criticized institutions that warehoused the mentally ill rather than treating them. He believed, as far as the record shows, that he believed what he wrote. He was not cynical in his stated commitments. He was a man who had built an institution he was proud of and who needed that institution to function, which required it to have the cooperation of the families who brought patients to it, which meant that in any individual case where a family's wishes and a patient's interests diverged, the family's wishes were the ones the institution could not afford to lose. This calculation was never stated explicitly. It did not need to be. It was structural. It was in the architecture of the institution, the way load-bearing walls are in architecture, invisible from the inside, essential to the whole standing up. Elizabeth understood this. She wrote about it in terms that were clinical in their clarity. The doctor's interest and the husband's interest are the same interest, which is the interest of men in the management of women, and I do not blame Dr. McFarland for serving it, since that is what the institution requires of him. I blame the institution. The meeting with Theophilus in autumn 1861 was followed by a change in McFarland's records. The new notes describe Elizabeth's religious views as persistent and fixed, language that, in the psychiatric vocabulary of the era, carried clinical weight. Fixed ideas, monomania, a disorder of thought rather than a disagreement of opinion. The semantic shift was small. The legal and institutional consequences were total. Elizabeth noticed, Dr. McFarland, she wrote in her journal that winter, has decided which master he serves. I do not think he is an evil man. I think he is a careful one, which in this place is worse. There was a woman on her ward that winter. Elizabeth calls her simply Mrs. T in her journal, either to protect the woman's identity or because Elizabeth herself did not know her surname. Mrs. T had been committed in 1858 by her father, who had disapproved of the man she wished to marry. The man she wished to marry had since married someone else. The father had died in 1860. There was no one left to request her discharge. She was 31 years old. She sat by the window every morning for exactly 2 hours, doing nothing visible, just sitting in a way that made the other women on the ward unable to look at her for too long. Elizabeth wrote to her brother about Mrs. T. The letter was not delivered. She wrote to a state legislator. One of several letters she managed to get out through a sympathetic laundress whose name appears nowhere in the records, who will not be known by history, who tucked letters inside bundles of linen and carried them out through the service entrance on Thursday mornings. The legislator did not respond. She wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln, who was by then President of the United States. There is no record that the letter reached him. The sympathy that went nowhere, the letters that were discarded, the laundress whose name history swallowed. These were the actual mechanics of a system designed to be escape-proof. not through physical force alone, though the physical force was real, but through the systematic severing of every thread that a woman might use to pull herself back into the world. The asylum isolated not just the body, but the voice. And for Elizabeth Packard, who understood that her voice was the only tool she had, the interception of her letters was not merely an inconvenience, it was the primary mechanism of her imprisonment. To understand the scale of what Elizabeth was fighting, you need numbers. And the numbers are genuinely difficult to pin down, because the records of asylum commitments in the 19th century are inconsistent, incomplete, and organized, or rather disorganized, by a patchwork of state institutions that had different record-keeping standards and different incentives for what they recorded and what they did not. But historians who have worked through these records, notably Barbara Sapinsley in her 1991 study of the Packard case, and Susan Brownmiller in broader histories of women's institutionalization, have documented patterns that are clear enough. In the 1860s through the 1890s, women were committed to American asylums at roughly the same rate as men, and in some institutions at higher rates. The reasons cited in the intake records for women include categories that do not appear in the men's records: domestic trouble, religious excitement, novel reading, hysteria from grief over a husband's behavior, disappointment in love, ill treatment by husband. These are not my interpretations. These are the words in the records. The Utica State Lunatic Asylum in New York published annual reports throughout this period that listed the supposed causes of insanity for each patient. The 1880 report lists, among the causes cited for female patients, domestic trouble, which was, in practice, the institutional language for a wife who was unhappy, as the third most common cause of female insanity in the institution that year. Not the third most common condition, the third most commonly cited cause. The word supposed in the header of that column was doing a great deal of work. Elizabeth lasted 3 years in that understanding. She was released in June 1863. Not because McFarland had changed his assessment. Not because Theophilus had softened. The Illinois law allowed a husband to discharge his wife from the institution the same way it allowed him to commit her, by request, alone. Theophilus decided, for reasons that are not entirely clear from the historical record, to bring her home. He may have needed someone to manage the household. The youngest child was 3 years old. Whatever the reason, the request came. And Elizabeth walked out of Jacksonville on a June morning, after 1,095 days, carrying a bag that contained her journal and a change of clothes and the names of every patient she had been able to document. She went home to Montano. She walked into the house. It smelled the same: bread, and the particular dust of the parlor where Theophilus kept his books, and underneath both of those the smell of children, of small people living in a space. The children were there. The infant, now 3 1/2, looked at her with the polite uncertainty of a child studying a stranger. The older ones embraced her. Theophilus stood in the doorway of his study and watched. She was home for 4 months before he locked her in her room. She had begun talking to neighbors. She had begun talking to the women at church, quietly, carefully, asking questions about the law, about what rights a woman had, about whether there was any mechanism by which a person could challenge a commitment. Theophilus heard what she was doing. In November 1863, he locked the bedroom door from the outside and told the children their mother was not well and was resting. She was in that room for 2 weeks. She wrote while she was in there, on whatever paper she could find, with a pen she had hidden in her shoe. Her neighbor, a woman named Sybil Dole, heard what was happening through another neighbor who had spoken to Elizabeth through the bedroom window. Mrs. Dole went to the local judge, a man named Charles Starr, and filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus. This was legally extraordinary. A writ of habeas corpus filed on behalf of a married woman challenging a husband's authority over her person. Judge Starr granted it. He ordered a trial. Theophilus was genuinely surprised. He had not expected a judge to intervene between a man and his wife. The law, as he understood it, was clear. He had, after all, followed it exactly. The trial began January 12, 1864, in the Kankakee County Courthouse. Elizabeth Packard walked in and took a seat at the table, and the courtroom, this is in the newspaper accounts, went very quiet. She was 47 years old. She had been locked in a bedroom for 2 weeks before this, and in an asylum for 3 years before that. She sat straight. One newspaper account noted that she was the calmest person in the room. Outside, the temperature was in the low teens. The courthouse had a single wood stove in the main chamber that heated approximately the front third of the room adequately, and the back third not at all. Spectators had come. The trial had been announced, and Kankakee County was not large, and the story of Elizabeth Packard had traveled ahead of the trial itself through the neighbor networks of small-town Illinois, so that most of the people in that room knew her, or knew of her, or knew someone who knew her, and had opinions about what had happened. The bench seating was full. People stood along the walls. Several women were there, which the newspaper accounts note with something between observation and editorial, the presence of women being, evidently, a feature of the scene worth recording. Theophilus had retained a lawyer. His lawyer argued that Elizabeth's religious views were evidence of insanity, specifically that her beliefs about free moral agency and the nature of God's grace were aberrant from Calvinist orthodoxy, which was itself a sign of disordered thinking. The argument, when you strip it to its core, was this: she disagreed with her husband about God. Therefore, she was insane. McFarland testified. He was careful, always careful. He said that Elizabeth had demonstrated peculiarities of belief during her time at Jacksonville. He did not say she was insane. He also did not say, not directly, not under direct examination, what his intake notes had said in June 1860. The judge did not ask him. There was a reason the judge did not ask him, which is that the judge had not yet seen the intake notes, and no one had told him to look. Elizabeth testified. She spoke for 2 hours. She addressed the question of her religious beliefs directly, explained them, cited scripture, argued their coherence. She addressed the conditions at Jacksonville. She spoke without notes. At one point, her lawyer asked her whether she believed herself to be sane, and she paused for what every account describes as a long moment, and then she said, "I ask only that you judge my words by the same standard you would apply to any other witness in this room." The jury of 12 men retired to deliberate. 7 minutes. The foreman stood and read the verdict. Elizabeth Packard was sane, had been sane, was sane at the time of her commitment, was sane now. 7 minutes. They deliberated for 7 minutes, which means that 12 men living in 1864 Illinois, with everything their culture had told them about women and marriage, and the authority of husbands, and the authority of doctors, required 7 minutes to conclude that what had been done to this woman was wrong. The speed of the verdict is not a triumph. It is an indictment. It is 7 minutes asking the question of how this happened for 3 years. Theophilus left Kankakee shortly after. He took the children. The law allowed him to take the children, and relocated to Massachusetts, where he had family. Elizabeth did not see most of her children for years. The legal victory that freed her did not give her back the thing that had been taken. This is a thing about legal victories that the law does not advertise. She stayed in Illinois. She had work to do. She wrote a book. She wrote several. Eventually, the first was Marital Power Exemplified in Mrs. Packard's Trial, published in 1864, which was exactly what it sounds like. She printed copies herself. She sold them door to door. She gave them to legislators. She stood in parlors and on courthouse steps and in the offices of newspaper editors, and she told her story, and she told it the same way every time, without embellishment, because she understood that embellishment was a luxury she could not afford, that the plain facts were sufficient, and that anyone who found them insufficient was someone whose cooperation she no longer needed. The reform work was specific. It was not abstract advocacy. It was statute drafting, the granular work of writing the actual language of laws. She had taught herself enough about legislative process to know that the language of a statute was the statute, that vague language was exploitable and exploitable language was worthless. When she drafted the Illinois bill, she specified the jury trial requirement, the notice period, the right to present witnesses, the right to be present at the hearing. She had learned from her own case what each of those provisions would have changed, and she put each of them in. There were legislators who tried to water down the jury trial requirement, to substitute a panel of physicians instead, which was, she understood perfectly, just the old system with a new name, since a panel of physicians in 1866 had the same structural incentive to defer to husbands that McFarland had had. She fought each dilution individually. She was meticulous about it. She was tiresome about it, in the way that people who are right and persistent are always tiresome. By 1867, she had gotten the Illinois legislature to pass a law requiring a jury trial before any person could be committed to an asylum against their will. Any person. Not just women. Not just wives. The legislation was, by contemporary standards, radical. It was also imperfect. It exempted certain categories. It had enforcement gaps. It could be worked around. But it existed where nothing had existed before, and its existence meant that the thing that had happened to Elizabeth Packard could not happen in exactly that way again in Illinois. She moved to other states: Iowa, Massachusetts, Maine, Connecticut. She drafted model legislation, and she pushed it through state houses by the sheer mechanical force of her presence. Showing up, talking to people, being impossible to dismiss, because she was, as everyone who met her noted, entirely uninterested in being dismissed. In 1874, she testified before the Massachusetts legislature. In 1875, she testified before Congress. She wore the same dark dress to most of these appearances. She carried a leather portfolio that contained her notes, the relevant statutes of each state, and, always, the original writ of habeas corpus from the Kankakee County Courthouse, folded small at the bottom. She changed commitment laws in at least 6 states. The sources disagree on the exact number. Some historians say 5, some say 7. The variance depending on how you count partial reforms versus comprehensive statute changes. What is not disputed is that she did it, and that she did it as a woman with no institutional support, no formal legal training, no organization behind her, no husband, and no money she had not earned herself through book sales. Now here is Lydia. Note, she is a composite, assembled from documented cases in the Illinois, Massachusetts, and Indiana asylum records of the 1870s and 1880s. She is not a single real person. But every element of her story is drawn from real records, and the institutional reality she represents is entirely historical. Lydia Smith was committed to the Illinois Eastern Hospital for the Insane in 1880. She was 26 years old, with a habit of underlining passages in the novels she borrowed from the circulating library, a habit her husband had first found endearing and then found alarming, because the passages she underlined were increasingly about women who left. The intake form noted excessive interest in romantic fiction as a presenting symptom. It also noted that she had, on 2 occasions, refused to prepare the evening meal, and had told her husband that she was tired, which the intake form described as marked disinclination to perform domestic duties. There was a third notation, almost an afterthought at the bottom of the form, in smaller handwriting, that said, "Patient expressed desire to seek employment outside the home." 3 things. She underlined novels. She said she was tired. She wanted a job. She was, by the formal diagnostic criteria of the day, suffering from hysteria. This was a real diagnosis, applied by real doctors, in real medical institutions, to real women. It appears in the records of every major asylum in the United States in this period, applied with a consistency that suggests not a disease, but a function. The word comes from the Greek for uterus. The medical theory underlying it held that women were uniquely susceptible to nervous disorders because of the demands of their reproductive biology, that the uterus and its attendant functions placed a physiological strain on the female nervous system that predisposed women to emotional instability, irrationality, and disordered behavior. This theory was mainstream. It was not fringe medicine. It was taught in medical schools, published in medical journals, cited in court proceedings. The doctors who applied it were not frauds. They believed it. This is perhaps the most difficult thing to hold about the history of psychiatric diagnosis. That belief in the diagnosis was entirely genuine, and that the diagnosis was nonetheless being used, consciously or not, to manage social behavior rather than to treat illness. Both things were simultaneously true. Hysteria described, essentially, women who were difficult. Women who were unhappy in ways that disturbed the people around them. Women who were sick, sometimes genuinely sick. And women who were merely inconvenient, and the diagnosis did not always trouble itself to distinguish between them. Lydia spent 4 years in the Eastern Hospital. She did not write a book. She did not become a reformer. She did not have a sympathetic neighbor who knew a judge. The reforms Elizabeth Packard had won in Illinois required a jury trial. But the jury trial provision had a gap, one of the enforcement gaps Elizabeth had known about and tried to close and had not been able to, and Lydia's commitment fell into that gap in a way that her husband's lawyer had been careful to ensure. She was released in 1884, when her husband filed for divorce on the grounds of incompatibility, at which point she was no longer his legal responsibility, and the institution had no particular reason to hold her. She went to her mother's house in Springfield. She was 30 years old. The record of what happened to her after 1884 disappears, the way most women's records disappear, into the silence that takes up most of history. Elizabeth Packard lived until 1897. She was 80 years old, with the same dark eyes and the same quality of stillness that people had been describing since she was in her 20s, the quality of waiting for you to say the wrong thing so she could correct you with evidence. She was not a saint. She was prickly, and had a reformer's particular blindness to opposition. She had been right about so many things that it had become difficult for her to entertain the possibility that she might occasionally be wrong, which is a limitation that is understandable in context and still a limitation. She could be imperious. She took up a great deal of oxygen in a room. These are the complaints of people who spent time with her. She also changed the law in at least 6 states, while funding herself through book sales and traveling by rail alone in an era when women did not do that, which is context that transforms the complaints into something closer to footnotes. She never saw much of her children again. The youngest one, the infant she had left on the morning of June 18th, 1860, the baby who had learned to walk without her, who had grown up in Theophilus's household being told his mother was ill. He did eventually write to her. She was in her 70s by then. The letter is in the archives at the Illinois State Historical Library. It is short. It asks how she is getting on. It does not mention the asylum directly. It does not mention his father directly. It is, reading it now, the letter of a person who has chosen his words very carefully for a very long time and has not stopped choosing. She wrote back. Her letter is not in the archive. A psychiatrist I spoke with, contemporary, practicing in Chicago, with a subspecialty in civil commitment law, told me that the question Elizabeth Packard spent her life trying to answer has never actually been resolved. The criteria for involuntary commitment have changed enormously, she said. We require dangerousness now. Danger to self or to others. Not just mental illness. The safeguards are much stronger. The abuses Elizabeth documented could not happen in quite the same way today. She paused. But the fundamental question, who decides when someone is unable to judge their own best interest? We still haven't fully answered that. I asked her whether the diagnostic biases Elizabeth encountered had been fully eliminated. She thought about it for a moment. Eliminated is a strong word, she said. Reduced. The explicit gendered categories are gone. Hysteria as a formal diagnosis was retired decades ago, but the research on how involuntary commitment decisions get made in practice shows persistent disparities. Race, gender, class, education level. These still influence the clinical encounter in ways that are documented, but not fully addressed. She looked at me directly when she said the next part. The thing about Elizabeth Packard's case that I find most disturbing, professionally, and I say this as someone who works in commitment proceedings, is not that McFarland was a bad doctor. It's that he was probably a typical one. He had institutional pressures. He had a patient whose account challenged the institutional account. He made a judgment call. And the judgment call happened to align perfectly with the interests of the person who had committed her. She paused again. That dynamic has not disappeared. The names have changed. The legal safeguards are better. But the structural pressure on the clinician to defer to the family, to defer to the system, that's still there. We don't talk about it enough. This is true. The legal framework is different. The abuses are different in character, less overt, less gendered in the blunt way they were in 1860. The civil commitment laws Elizabeth won now have counterparts in every state, and those laws have been amended, challenged, revised, amended again. The Americans with Disabilities Act changed some things. Multiple Supreme Court decisions changed others. Advocates have won real victories. And still, every year, tens of thousands of Americans are involuntarily committed to psychiatric facilities. Some of them need the intervention. Some of them do not. The mechanisms for distinguishing between these cases are better than they were in 1860, but they are not perfect, and the imperfections fall hardest on the people who are already vulnerable. The poor, the people of color, the people without family connections or institutional advocates, the people who, for whatever reason, cannot make the argument for their own sanity in a language the system recognizes. The asylum Elizabeth walked into in 1860 still stands. The building is there, on the grounds of what is now the Jacksonville Developmental Center, a different kind of institution, serving a different population, with a different set of laws governing its operation. The red brick has been repointed. The Italianate tower is visible from the road. The records of the patients who were held there, the intake forms, the staff notes, the ledgers that contained 3 words in McFarland's handwriting. Patient appears rational, followed by years of careful revision. Those records are held in the state archives, accessible to researchers. Elizabeth Packard's intake file is there. The 3 words are still in it. And here is what I want to leave you with. Because I have spent a long time in these archives, and I have read the letters, and the court filings, and the newspaper accounts, and the psychiatric records, and I want to be precise about what I found and what I did not find. I found a woman who understood, from the first moment the bedroom door opened on the morning of June 18th, 1860, that no one was coming to save her, and who made, in that moment of understanding, the decision to save herself. Which is not an inspiring story exactly, because inspiring stories do not cost what this one cost. Do not take 3 years away from your children and leave you writing letters in a locked room and watching your youngest learn to walk in someone else's care. It is a story about what it takes to survive a system that has decided what you are. I found a doctor who knew better and chose differently, not out of cruelty, but out of the more ordinary cowardice of a man who understood where his institutional interests lay and acted accordingly, and who went home at night and probably slept without difficulty, and who is not remembered now except in the case of the woman who outlasted him. I found a law that said, without embarrassment, that a married woman's mind was not her own to defend, and I found that law repealed and replaced by better laws, and I found that the better laws also have gaps, and that the gaps are filled by people who are vulnerable, because that is what gaps are for. The question the title asks, whether women were locked away for speaking their minds, the answer is yes. Demonstrably documented in the archives, yes. But the harder question is the one that doesn't go away when the archive closes. The question of who holds the power to define sanity, and what that power is used for, and who it is used against. Elizabeth Packard spent 30 years trying to answer it. She changed 6 states. She did not answer it. It is still open. And the distance between Elizabeth Packard's bedroom in 1860 and the gaps in our current civil commitment statutes is shorter than we find comfortable and longer than we have managed to close.